Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we are unpacking a really fascinating slice of history where pop culture directly collides with hard, cold data. We're going to explore the 1980 Cuban exodus. You probably know it as the Mariel Boatlift. And we'll look at how the real history, and especially the actual economics of this massive event, completely dismantle a very famous Hollywood stereotype.
So here's the core mystery we're going to solve today. Imagine a single city absorbing 125,000 people in just a matter of months. Did this massive, sudden influx of refugees really crash the local economy? We're going to dive into some hard economic data from the Miami labor market to answer that exact question.
All right, here's our roadmap for today. First, the myth of Scarface. Then, the crisis at the embassy, followed by the Mariel Boatlift itself. After that, we'll look at the Miami economic experiment. And finally, the Marielito legacy. Let's jump right in.
Section 1. The Myth of Scarface. Pop culture versus reality.
If you've ever seen the 1983 movie Scarface, you know exactly what I'm talking about. For decades, this film literally defined the Mariel Boatlift for the general public, and honestly, it deeply stigmatized the refugees in the process. You might remember the opening text, claiming that Castro essentially emptied his prisons, sending 30,000 hardened criminals straight to Miami. That single piece of Hollywood fiction cemented this image of the Marielito as a violent thug in the minds of the American public.
But get this, the reality? It's closer to 3,000. Out of the more than 125,000 folks who fled Cuba during the boatlift, the actual estimated number of serious criminals was around 3,000. Now, obviously, any crime is an issue, but mathematically speaking, that is drastically smaller than the 30,000 that the Hollywood myth suggests. The vast majority were literally just law-abiding families who were desperate for a better life.
Moving on to Section 2, Crisis at the Embassy, the breaking point in Havana.
So to really understand why this mass exodus happened, we have to look past the criminal conspiracy theories and look at what was actually going on in Cuba at the time. The real inciting incident was a severe economic collapse. Cuba was dealing with crazy inflation, terrible struggles in their crucial tobacco and sugar markets, lowered living standards, and just this general economic stagnation. And of course, this was all exacerbated by the U.S. embargo and a stagnating Soviet economy that Cuba heavily relied on. The result? Deep, widespread disillusionment across the entire Cuban population.
Things escalated incredibly fast during what became known as the Peruvian embassy crisis. It all boiled over on April 1, 1980, when a group of desperate Cubans literally crashed a bus through the gates of the Peruvian embassy in Havana just to claim asylum. In the chaos, a Cuban guard was accidentally killed by friendly fire. When Peru refused to hand the asylum seekers over, the Cuban government made a highly strategic move on April 4th. They withdrew all their security forces from the embassy perimeter. Within days, folks noticed the gates were unguarded, and an astonishing 10,000 asylum seekers flooded this tiny compound. The pressure cooker had officially burst.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Mariel Boatlift. The exodus begins.
Now listen to this quote from Fidel Castro on May 1, 1980. "Those who have no revolutionary genes, we do not want them, we do not need them." Pretty intense, right? These defiant words totally capture the political hostility of the era. Facing a massive embarrassment with the embassy crisis, Castro completely reversed Cuba's long-standing strict immigration restrictions. Almost overnight, he declared the Port of Mariel open to absolutely anyone who wanted to leave, provided someone came to get them.
What followed was a massive clash of intentions. On one side, Cuban exiles in Florida hear the news and immediately mobilize, sending over 1,700 private boats across the dangerous Florida Straits on a rescue mission for their families. But then you have the government's mandate. When these boats arrived at Mariel, Cuban authorities effectively held them hostage to a brand new rule. To take their relatives, the boat captains were forced to also transport individuals the Cuban state had specifically selected to be removed from the island.
The Cuban government basically used this crisis to purge the island of groups they horribly labeled escoria, or trash. They forced marginalized groups onto these boats. We're talking political dissidents, psychiatric patients, members of the LGBTQ+ community, and yes, that small percentage of convicted criminals. The regime weaponized the exodus, ensuring the demographics of this wave of migrants would be fundamentally different and honestly far more challenging for the U.S. to process than previous waves.
Now for the really fascinating part. Section 4, the Miami economic experiment. The data plot twist.
So what actually happens to a city's economy when tens of thousands of refugees arrive in just a few months? Well, the Mariel Boatlift resulted in a sudden 7% increase in the Miami labor force. That's like adding roughly 45,000 workers, many of them less skilled, almost overnight. I want you to really think about what you assume would happen here. Standard supply and demand logic would tell us this massive influx should immediately crash local wages and just skyrocket unemployment for native workers, right?
But the data reveals a massive plot twist. In 1990, an economist named David Card published a groundbreaking study on this exact event. He compared Miami's labor market to 4 similar cities: Atlanta, Los Angeles, Houston, and Tampa. And what he found was wild. For less skilled, non-Cuban native workers in Miami, wages and unemployment remained virtually unaffected. In fact, while real wages were steadily declining in those comparison cities over the early 1980s, Miami's wages for less skilled workers stayed remarkably stable. The economic catastrophe everyone predicted? It simply never happened.
I know, right? How is that even possible? Well, it comes down to 2 main things. First, Miami already had this really robust textile and apparel industry that relied on less skilled labor, so they easily absorbed the new workers. Second, and this is absolutely crucial, there was a sharp drop in domestic migration. Americans in other states who were planning to move to Miami saw the news of the boat lift and just decided to move somewhere else instead. This sudden drop in domestic arrivals perfectly counterbalanced the massive refugee influx, keeping the total population growth completely manageable.
Finally, Section 5, the Marielito Legacy, Humanizing the Statistics.
Looking at the geopolitical side of things, this whole event became a massive political liability for the Carter administration. Even though Carter initially welcomed the refugees, the sheer logistical strain of processing over 125,000 people combined with an absolute media frenzy caused huge headaches during the 1980 election year. It heavily tested the newly enacted Refugee Act of 1980 and literally forced the creation of special immigration categories just to handle the unprecedented volume.
And for the refugees themselves, it was incredibly tough. You see, the earlier waves of Cuban exiles back in the 1960s were largely welcomed. They generally arrived with more middle-class resources and received substantial federal aid. The 1980s Marielitos faced a completely different reality. Because of their more diverse, working-class backgrounds and those heavy stigmas amplified by pop culture, they faced systemic neglect. They got significantly shorter periods of assistance and battled deep cultural alienation, sometimes even from established Cuban-American communities.
To wrap up our explainer today, I want to leave you with a really poignant thought from the acclaimed novelist Reynaldo Arenas, who is actually a Marielito refugee himself. He said, "You escaped, but still the house burned down." I think that perfectly captures the complex, bittersweet human reality of the boat lift. It really leaves us to rethink the pop culture myths we so easily accept. I mean, if the economic doom wasn't real and the Hollywood criminal stereotype was vastly overblown, it begs the question, how much of what we believe about modern refugee crises today is based on fear rather than facts? Thanks so much for joining me, and keep questioning what you see.